Hi, welcome back to Kennings Cantrips. I'm Russ.
And I'm Morgan.
On this episode, we're going to continue our discussion from last time. We have guests David J. West and our returning guest, Hans Schantz. We're talking about story structure and pacing. In particular, in this episode, we're going to talk about pacing and tools that we use to help structure our stories well.
Do either one of you use any of the sort of guides that are out there for story pacing when you write your books? Or do you just kind of do what feels right? There are several, there's the Lester Dent story layout, and then Save the Cat, and several others that get talked about a lot.
Well, I have to confess to having been completely ignorant of those formal story structure and story pacing concepts and methods. When I wrote my first book, I was under the impression that in a thriller, you wanted to have a constantly escalating sense of tension and pacing. And in fact, I thought a linear escalation was too boring, so I was going to make mine parabolic. Now, the result was that the beginning of my story was rather slow, and that was one of the complaints that the number of reviewers had about the very first part of my first story. But then it really picks up in the second half as the story starts to accelerate. In my second book, what I did was I tried to make each chapter have its own conflict and resolution that, in resolving, left open issues that could then escalate into the next chapter. But one of the problems and challenges I face in my writing is I have a number of physics and political mysteries that are floating around, and I have to get a lot of dominoes in place before I'm ready for the final climax and resolution where I can start the dominoes falling one after the other. So far, I have been winging it, but I've been appreciating getting out and learning about alternate techniques for trying to control the pacing to deliver a satisfactory effort.
How about you, David?
It's definitely a process. I mean, I've read the Lester Dent formula. I've read Save the Cat books just because I was always excited on picking up whatever I could find that might work for me. So it is always whatever works for you, because there's no one size fits all here.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. Yeah.
For me, it's like I think about what I like and what I want and what I'm writing, because ultimately I'm trying to put down something that I think is amazing, and hopefully lots of other people like it. But there's, a million different tastes out there. And sometimes I'll start with, because I'm a very seat of the pants writer, but at the same time, I'm trying to follow my own pseudo Lester Dent formula of thinking, okay, I need this to happen, then this, then this, then this. And when it comes to the pacing, I'm thinking, okay, I want people to love this first sentence, have to read the rest of the paragraph, and then the next one, and then be so hooked at the end, the way I end that chapter, that they have to read the next chapter. And I guess that's, it's nothing revolutionary new. It's just what I attempt to do. I could definitely say I've gotten better since my first book. The first book probably had too much baggage.
That leads to a question that I think is interesting. You're the one out of the group today who has definitely written the most, so I think you're the best one to answer this. How has your approach to that changed over time as you've been writing?
With the first book, I just knew I wanted to do something nobody else had done, and I started that. And it ended up at this monstrous size of like 250,000 words. And I found that I couldn't sell that back in 2008, 2009 for just being a newbie with anything local. So I ended up breaking it in half. And luckily, my halfway chapter was a pseudo good cliffhanger for the rest of the book. And so it's definitely become more conscious on my part to try and, instead of just feeling like this is a good end of the scene, I will try to end a scene making you wanting more. So it's conscious on my part to try and make you keep turning the pages, because I want to make a living at this. Still want to do what I love to do, but I want to make a living. Not quite there yet, but 2017 has been better for me than ever before. So it's slowly but surely getting there.
Fantastic. How about you, Hans? You've got a couple books out yourself. How has your approach changed over time? I guess you talked about that a little bit. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I tended to take a less structured approach in my first book, where I just kind of let the story unfold at the pace that I was comfortable writing it. In the second book, I was more deliberate about trying to make sure I wasn't boring, trying to make sure that I kept a good mix of conflict and then partial resolution, but always with a teaser to keep the reader engaged and wanting to see what happens in the next chapter, or a resolution that only makes matters worse and escalates the tension and makes you want to go on and see what's going to happen. So I'm getting more cognizant of trying to not be boring, trying to have a good mix of action and then slower catch your breath parts to keep the reader's attention.
That's interesting, because that sounds a little bit like some of the evolution I'm going through myself. My first novel, due out in September, was very, very seat of the pants. My natural inclination is very much like David to write as a process, as a tinkerer, and fairly unstructured. Naturally, I'm a tinkerer at heart on everything. That's kind of how I approach things. The downside I found for me personally was that I had a little bit of some pacing issues in my first draft, and I ended up fixing a lot of those in the editing process, which fits well with the tinkering mindset. But the real downfall that I found was that it's just took me way too long to write the book that way. My process moving forward, I'm trying to move to a more structured, outlined process just for the speed, because it just takes too long the other way for me. Even though it's what I prefer to do and I enjoy better, it's just too slow.
Oh, I agree completely. The way I have approached really my first two books is I had a general sense of my start and my end point and where I wanted to go. I had a dozen really cool scenes that I wanted to put in there that kind of fit along the path. And I actually, wrote those exciting scenes first and then connected in between them. And of course, I discover that, this scene doesn't work there. I'm going to have to move it earlier, or I'm going to have to move that one later, or this doesn't make sense. I'm going to have to throw that out entirely and write a different scene. So yeah, it was a more seat of the pants approach. And I'm also trying to move to a more outlined approach to more rigorously work through how all the events will interconnect before I spend a lot of time writing prose that I'm going to have to end up cutting. I mean, my second book ended up at about 100,000 words, and I had to throw away, well, I didn't completely throw it away, but I had to cut about 25,000 words from my original beginning and start at a completely different place, because ultimately I realized it did not make sense. I was able to rework some of the material into the story, but you have to be careful not to get going on a false trail and end up somewhere you don't want to be in your story.
I had a similar experience there too. My first novel, its release length is just a hair over 80,000 words. The first draft was just shy of 110,000 words, and I went through and just cut pretty ruthlessly, and a lot of it was because of the unstructured process. I just had too much time in the story where not very much was happening, and the pacing improved really dramatically when I did that. But again, that's the slow way to do it. It worked really well, and I'm very happy with the result that I got. But that meant that I had to write about an extra 30,000 words almost in order to get there. And that's a lot of words. That's a lot of writing time.
Oh, absolutely.
How about you, Morgan? Do you have anything to add to that yourself?
Well, I am the only one out of all of us that does not have a finished novel, but I have an ongoing sword and sorcery series that's a collection of novellas and short stories that are all the same characters. So I have actually written the word count for a novel, even though it's not one consistent story. And similar to what you guys are talking about, I found that having a structure makes it way faster and also kind of guards against writer's block for me. Because if I have the high points in the story and I know this happens here and this happens here and then this is the ending, then I can write all of that. And then it just becomes, okay, I have to link all of this together. And the first draft of it might not be the best, but when I know where I'm going, I can I can throw out 1,000 words here to link these two scenes together. And then it keeps me from getting hung up on where do we go next or anything like that. And some of these plot structuring layouts, like Save the Cat is the one I've actually have the novel I'm working on right now completely plotted out using Save the Cat, because it kind of helps lead the story beats. So it's like, well, I don't have this in my story yet, so I'll just come up with something for that. And then kind of having that guidance actually helps my creative juices get flowing to figure out what else needs to be in there. So I have a whole plot instead of just kind of meandering with my writing.
Yeah, the thing I love about Save the Cat is how much he said have that log line, so that you know that one sentence what this is about, so that you can never get off track because you know what this is about. To me, that was just super valuable.
That was really helpful for me too. And the nice thing about having that as well is not just that it helps you write the story, but when you're done with the story, it helps you write the copy text of,
oh yeah,
how am I going to sell this story to my potential readers and present it in a way that they want to hear.
Definitely.
And that's it for this topic. We'll be back soon for episode 2.3, where we are going to talk about genre tropes. All of us kind of work in different genres, so we're going to talk about what tropes work, which ones don't, why we think they have the tropes, and which ones we like to break. So we hope to have you back next time. Thanks.